Hey everybody, welcome to Module 13A. Hope that everyone's doing well. As always, I recognize that we are coming down the home stretch of our term together, and I also recognize that many people might be hitting some kind of a wall. We talked about this recently, but if you're finding yourself behind in our class at all, or feeling like things aren't going well for you, just throw me an email. Let's meet up for office hours or for what I call my student hours, and let's talk about ways that we can get through these next 4 modules. It's really important to me that not only you get through this term, with your sanity intact, but that you're enjoying the process to the extent possible, and that you learn. That you're understanding the kind of the core concepts and terms and theories that we're discussing here. I don't want this to be a miserable process for you. So if you're finding that it is, holler at me. Let's find out a way to make it more enjoyable, more productive for you. That said, today we're going to be talking about gender inequality. I've broken up this module into 2 kind of gender and sexuality kind of themes. As is the case with just about anything we talked about in our class thus far, both of these concepts and terms and topics could be their own class by themselves. We have a sociology of gender class that we offer here, touches on issues of gender inequality and sexism, as well as LGBTQ plus issues. So the readings for this module, the first group of readings, which we're going to cover today a little bit, deal with gender inequality in the workplace in terms of financial compensation and the ways in which women, specifically mothers in the workforce, are discriminated against, right? The ways in which pay inequity, unequal access to promotions and managerial positions, how that relates to gender, and the extent to which activists and experts have tried to push back on that and identify that as a problem, and to change it, right? We'll talk about some other kind of offshoot kind of issues, or how those issues look in specific kinds of workplaces, because depending on the social institutional context, the organizational context, it could be a very different kind of story, right? Gender inequality in the medical profession could look very different than gender inequality in the educational profession, or then in science and medicine, or in engineering, or in, as we're going to talk about, professional sports, for example, right? So we'll talk about some concepts that activists and experts have used to identify problems and the extent to which they've been successful in bringing about substantive change. Okay, and we'll finish up today by considering what an intersectional analysis looks like when we think about gender inequality. Okay, what it means to bring multiple kind of social identities, multiple social locations, social structural kind of systems of power, what it means to overlap them, right? How gender inequality could look different for Black folks versus Latinx folks versus indigenous people, right? Gender justice might look different for working class folks as compared to middle class or wealthy folks, for example, right? This intersectional analysis is important, right? Gender inequality across age or disability, right? It could look different. So with that said, we're going to open by first talking about what is gender from a sociological perspective, right? Before we kind of dive into the topic for today, we need to get clear on some basic terminology. My apology if my video freezes up. It's been freezing up a couple times. This is my 3rd time trying to record this. So if my face freezes in some kind of awkward expression like this, just please forgive that and try to listen to the words and not look at my frozen, twisted face. After we get clear on some basic terminology, then we're going to talk about what gender inequality looks like in the workplace. What the data say, right? What is the evidence that exists that inequality does exist in the workplace, and is that convincing, right? And how has that evidence been used by both expert claims makers and activist claims makers to try to push for change, right? To push for institutional change to policies and practices, and to push for change, at the level of government, right? To make it illegal to discriminate against women in hiring practices and promotion practices and in compensation, right? And we'll wrap up by talking about two potential solutions that have been put forward as ways to solve these problems, right? These are kind of ideological solutions, not necessarily policies, but ideological solutions, social movements that have very much policy solutions in mind and baked into them. But we're going to talk about feminism, okay? And we'll talk about feminism both historically and like today, right? How it exists today, how people think about feminism, the extent to which feminism has entered mainstream kind of discourse, or the extent to which feminism is still kind of resisted as a term or a concept, right? And why that is, why people would be hesitant to identify themselves as a feminist, right? And we'll wrap up today, like I said earlier, by considering what an intersectional analysis looks like when we talk about gender inequality, okay? When we bring in other layers, other social identities and social locations, how that changes social problems work, claims making work with regards to gender inequality, right? So really quickly off the bat, it's important to get some basic terms down, okay? So when we talk about gender, right, it's important that we get clear on what that is, okay? So when we talk about gender, sex, and sexuality, these terms, especially gender and sex, tend to be used interchangeably by people, right? If you've ever heard of someone having a gender reveal party, as I'm talking to you right now, it is November of 2020. Just a couple months ago, we had, not even a couple, maybe 2 months ago, we had a massive forest fire, a wildfire in California that was started because a gender reveal party had some kind of like pyrotechnic component where they wanted an explosion or some fireworks or I don't know, something like that. Because the unexpecting couple wanted to reveal to their families or community what allegedly what the gender of their child was. Sociologically speaking, that's an inaccurate description, right? They're not actually revealing gender. That would be a sex reveal party. For whatever, I don't know. I'll save you the time and not go on my rant about how crazy it is that you would have that party. Anyways, let alone pyrotechnics. But when we talk about sex, what sex means is referring often to the chromosomal composition of a person. Okay, so to the extent that science and genetics and nature creep into our vocabulary, it's in the form of sex. Okay, but most times when people are having a gender reveal party, they're not actually basing that revelation on a genetic screening or a genetic test or a chromosomal kind of reveal. It's usually based on, it's like a black and white photo, a blurry black and white photo of the unborn child's like sexual reproductive organs, right? So blurry black and white pictures of baby junk is the basis of these parties, right? It's not actually a gender reveal party, right? If anything, it's a sex reveal party, and even when it's a sex reveal party, it's not a very definitive or like, it's not clearly a sex reveal party, right? We can do all kinds of critical analysis of gender reveal parties as a thing anyway. But when we talk about gender, okay, whereas sex is can be thought of as a box, okay? Depending on your chromosomal composition, you can be put into a box, okay? It's objective, okay? What is not objective is gender. Rather than thinking about gender as a box that you can put somebody in, gender is better thought of as a spectrum, okay? Imagine like here's my printer cable, right? So gender is like a continuum, right? On one end of the continuum, you have this thing that we call masculinity, and on the other end of the continuum, we have this thing that we call femininity, okay? Anybody can be anywhere they want to on this string, okay? Now there are very real and powerful social forces, cultural forces that police gender identity and gender performance. Okay, I'm performing gender right now, right, as I'm talking to you, right? what my hair looks like, what my glasses look like, the clothes that I put on my body this morning, right? I'm doing gender right now, right? The tone of my voice, the words I'm choosing, how I'm using my hands, everything I'm doing right now is gender, right? There is never a time or a place where you are not doing gender, okay? Gender is an activity. It is a performance. And that performance requires an audience, right? It also requires a performer and an actor or actors to do. And that performance, remember, it falls on that line somewhere, okay? Even when you can be critical of your own gender performance or the gender performance of other people, you're still doing it, right? Some people identify rather than as a male or female, masculine or feminine. Some folks reject that reject this idea of the spectrum altogether, and they purposely will mix and match. Right? They identify as what we call non-binary, which is their gender identity does not conform to either masculinity or femininity. That it might vary, right? I might be very masculine, let's say at work. I might be very feminine among my friends, or on the weekends when I'm hanging out with my loved ones. Gender performance is context specific. It is fluid. It is not natural at all. It is completely social. Okay, completely social. And sexuality is related to these. All three of these terms are related, by the way. Gender, sex, and sexuality, right? And when we think about sexuality, it's fluid, just like the gender performance on my iPhone charger. And with sexuality, right, we think of these the two ends rather than being femininity and masculinity. The two ends of those spectrums could be heterosexuality or queer. Okay, and again, it's fluid, right? And again, it's all socially produced, and it's based on performance, right? These things don't exist without people doing things. Okay, there's not a genetic component to gender, right? There's not a gene associated with sexuality. Okay, like all socially produced things, there are some very, very vague and abstract roots in genetics and hormones and pheromones and all that stuff. That's in the mix too. But when we talk about and we think about and we feel gender and sexuality, that's the social. Okay. Right. So again, we can talk for 16 different weeks about gender, sex, and sexuality, but it's important to get at least off the bat, know that gender and sex are different. Gender is socially produced. It is performative. Sex is, to the extent that boxes exist that you can put people in, it's with regards to sex, right? And even then, the boxes are multiple. It's not just XY and XX, right? There's multiple chromosomal compositions. There's folks who are intersex who are born with a mix of what is considered to be male or female reproductive organs or genitalia, right? So even then, there's not a clean hey, it's just two boxes, right? That's not, even then it's not. But to the extent that boxes exist, it's for sex. For gender, it's fluid. There is no box, right? It's the ocean, right? It's a spectrum, right? Okay. Right. So most of our conversation today is going to be about gender and work, right? So we're overlapping the social structure of gender, the system of power, this unique system of power called gender, with a social institutional context of work, the economy, right? So when we talk about how gender shapes the experience of being a worker, right? Historically, that has meant focusing on women, right? And as we'll talk about in a little bit, mostly focusing on the work experiences of middle-class white women have been kind of the window through which this has been studied and talked about, right? So when we talk about professional women, right, what we're talking about are women with at least a high school degree, more often than not, women with a college degree, right? And what I had you read today was an article researching the barriers that women with college degrees face to living successful fulfilling, happy professional lives. Okay. Arlie Hochschild's work is really instrumental here. In the next slide, I'm going to send you to watch a discussion thread of Professor Hochschild talking about her research. But she comes up with this idea of the second shift. Okay, and she uses that to describe, and this is in the late 80s where she's doing this research, right? So what she's talking about when she talks about the second shift is that women have, at the time of her research, had just begun really entering the professional workforce at historically unprecedented rates, right? The professional woman and the professional mother was this new thing, okay? Women were, at the time of her research, were approaching, if not surpassing, depending on the field, men's college degree attainment levels. And those women with college degrees were not trying to just get married, have kids, and not work, right? These are women who had, they'd spent their lives developing skills, right? They had, those skills had market value. They wanted to be a productive worker, right? They also wanted to have a family, right? And what Hochschild documents in the second shift is the ways in which cultural norms and structures and policies and practices were, relatively speaking, fast to change in the workplace and very slow to change in the family, right? Whereby women were working full-time jobs, making, very much being a contributor to the household income, but then still being expected to do all of the things that women have historically done in terms of mothering, right? In terms of emotional labor, in terms of making dinner, doing laundry, scheduling the family's life, basically, right? They weren't coming home and crashing on the couch, cracking a beer, and watching the football game, right? They had now 2 shifts to do, 2 full-time jobs, essentially, right? And yeah, this is a very personal issue for me as someone who has a very successful partner in my wife. I've experienced this as we've had our child, who's now 4.5, in navigating, our professional and our personal lives, right? I found myself multiple times having to check my own kind of gender expectations around like the domestic division of labor, right? And having to like be critical of myself when I bristle at like, my partner daring to have like professional aspirations and wanting to go and be, as successful and brilliant as she is. And she is very successful and very brilliant. But yeah, I also have friends in my life and family members in my life who very much still have this like normative like gender image in their head where the man is the breadwinner and any man who's not the breadwinner is like less of a man, and women's role is still to like cook and clean and do all that other stuff, and no real man does that stuff. And so it's a lot of patriarchal. The vestiges of patriarchy are very much with me still in my life. Like even sociologists who have this like awesome critical analysis of power and gender, like we experience this stuff too. We feel this stuff too, right? The gendered politics of sociology departments are still like unequal, right? The amount of work that women are expected to do, the kinds of work that women are expected to do in sociology, it's different. And it's underpaid and undervalued compared to the manly work or the masculine work, right? Even when women are doing that work, right? Okay. So can we think of gender inequality in the workplace as a social problem, right? Remember, a social problem, a troubling social condition is said to exist that is incompatible with the values of a significant number or a significant type of person who call for change. Okay, that's our 4-part definition we're still working on. Problem exists. People should care for some reason. Pisses people off, gets people angry, makes people happy, whatever. A bunch of people or an important kind of person agrees, and then there's a solution. Okay, a solution is put forward. So let's look at it. Before we get into the data and what the evidence that exists that there is gender inequality in the workplace, I want to throw you over to your first discussion thread where Arlie Hochschild will describe her research that allowed her to develop this concept of the second shift, right? And I want you to listen to her description of her research through the lens of social problems stuff, Okay, so grounds, warrants, and conclusions are in here. Okay, so go check it out. Engage with the prompt. Take a little break and come on back. We are at about 20 minutes. Okay, so what does the data look like? This is some, relatively speaking, recent data. It's about 10 years old now. There's a popular statistic that gets thrown out a lot when we're talking about gender inequality in work, and that's in terms of compensation. You might have heard some variation, and it changes every year, but some variation of women make 77 cents on the dollar. For every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 77% of that. And it fluctuates, right? Sometimes it's as low as 73, sometimes it's around 80. The big takeaway, though, is when you control for, that is when you hold constant education level, the kind of job folks have, how long they've been working, right? All these other ways that you can explain gender inequality without going to gender, right? All these other reasons that you might trot out. Well, men just tend to be in higher paying jobs, or men tend to have more master's degrees or PhDs or doctorates, right? Men just have been working in their jobs longer. When you hold all that constant, when you set that to equal, right? When you statistically minimize the influence of all those forces so that only gender is left, there's still a gap, right? Gender is there, and it's significant, right? When you control for all that stuff, the gap goes to 91 cents for every dollar, right? It's still sizable, right? If 9 cents different that's a significant difference. That's 9% less, right? Just by virtue of your gender, right? The gender category you're placed in, right? And here's a breakdown of what that looks like here, right? So this is the percentage of, or how much a woman employee in this kind of a job makes as a proportion in relation to a man, right? So women actually make more on average than men do in the profession of stock clerks and order filers. In the clerical world, right? Women actually make more than men in that world. In bookkeeping, accounting, and auditing, they make almost exactly the same. There's no gender gap at all. And for all of the other sectors here, or types of jobs, we see a gap, okay? And the trend that comes to my mind as I'm looking at this data is the more, in general, the more the higher the pay, the larger the gender gap in general. There are some exceptions, right? For example, for waiters and waitresses, right? It's one of the lowest paid jobs that's listed here on this chart, but there's still a gender gap there. But that's a little bit of an outlier. In general, we see with CEOs, financial managers, managerial positions in general, right? These are some of the highest paid software developers. These are the jobs that we see the highest gap. Okay. So yeah, in the higher pay, the larger the gender gap in general, with some exceptions. Okay. This is a statistic that came out under the Obama administration. This is back in 2012 when this was released. But yeah, not just looking at the one-off, one paycheck gender pay gap, but what does that gender pay gap look like over the life course, right? Over a person's entire working career. And that answer is that about $430,000 difference. Okay. That is a sizable chunk of money. I don't know. I shouldn't assume the kind of backgrounds that y'all are coming from, but in my mind, that's approaching $500,000 of wages that women will not earn in their lifetime on average. Okay, these are all averages that we're talking about, and these are national averages, right? Yeah, that's a lot of money that women are not receiving in compensation for the same kinds of work. Okay. So one of the terms that expert claims makers have developed through their research is the term the glass ceiling. And this is a classic example of naming the problem that Joel Best uses to talk about whenever a barrier exists to professional fulfillment, professional advancement, and success in a work setting, right? This is a term by some researchers in 2001 And they say a glass ceiling is a specific type of gender or racial inequality that can be distinguished from other types of inequality. Okay, this is different, right? It's a unique kind of thing. And this glass ceiling, it's not necessarily legally sanctioned, right? So we can't talk about, like Jim Crow era segregation when the law legally supported racial segregation. That wasn't a glass ceiling, right? That was a brick and mortar, everyone could see it ceiling, right? But this glass ceiling, this idea of it being invisible and still there, right, is a fundamental part of it, right? It's as much cultural as it is institutional and structural, right? That it's not just one simple thing that's leading to this complex issue, right? This complex gender gap, right? And I include this picture here of Kim Ng, who just last week, as I'm talking to you, was named the first ever general manager of a professional sports team in the United States. And that's not just in baseball. So she's now the GM for the Marlins, the Miami Marlins professional baseball team. But we're talking about all sports forever in the history of the United States, right? She's the first female general manager, I should say, for men's sports. I can't speak for the WNBA, but in terms of football, baseball, basketball, hockey, right? The kind of these big four that we talk about. I believe Major League Soccer and pro soccer as well. She is the first woman ever, right? So a lot of people are talking right now about the shattering of the glass ceiling here, right? And hopefully that's true, right? Hopefully this is, an indicator of a reduction in gender inequality, gender discrimination in pro sports in general, in baseball specifically. The skill sets that define a good general manager, turns out does not require you to be a man or to identify as a man, right? Those skill sets are possible to be found in other kinds of bodies and other kinds of people, right? But it's worth considering, right, why it took this long for this to happen, right? So Cotter and colleagues in 2001 argued that there are 4 criteria that need to be met in order for a glass ceiling to exist, right? Again, this is about gender and race, right? Both of these systems of power can be used to talk about glass ceilings. It can't be explained using other kind of job-relevant characteristics like we talked about earlier, like how long you've been working there, this kind of skills you have, how much education you have. All that can't be an explanation for it. There has to be something else, right, in order for a glass ceiling to exist. Another thing that has to happen for a glass ceiling to exist is that the higher you go up a hierarchy in a job, right, as you go from low-level employee all the way up to, let's say, the manager or the CEO, right, you see an increased evidence of that phenomenon, okay? And we saw that, right, with the gender pay gap, right, that in the highest paid kind of roles of managers and CEOs, chief executives, that there's an even more pronounced gender pay gap, right? So that checks that box. The third criterion relates mostly to demographically underrepresented groups, right? So this isn't about having a small group equally represented in managerial positions or in promotion decision making. If, for example, you're the only, let's say, indigenous or Native American employee in a company, if there's over the course of your career there's systemic evidence that you're being mistreated or passed over for promotion, it can't be written off as simply, well, there's only one indigenous person here in our whole company, therefore it's okay that there's no representation of indigenous people in positions above like entry level kind of employee positions, right? If you're the only trans person in a large business, right? Or one of only a couple trans folks. First of all, it's demographically speaking very unlikely, if not impossible. But if you were, and over the course of your career, there's evidence that you're being that opportunity for advancement and professional kind of promotion is happening, a glass ceiling can be said to exist, right? It's not just about. This third criteria is really important to keep in mind for groups of people who are drastically underrepresented, right, in companies, right? So as as women, for example, in the 70s and 80s started to enter in larger numbers into historically like male-dominated professions, this glass ceiling effect became clearer, right? Because there's more and more folks, and when you see the vast majority of this new demographic group only at the lowest rung of companies and not being promoted to, in leadership positions, then it becomes clear when there's a lot of them. But, the same effect can happen when there's not so many folks in a professional setting. And then finally, right, that it's not just about the organizational hierarchy and like having the glass ceiling become clearer the higher up you go, the hierarchy, but over the course of someone's individual career, that there's evidence when the evidence becomes clear that they're being denied professional opportunities, right? So there's those 4 different criteria that all need to be met in order for a glass ceiling to exist, right? So this chart, again, this is a little bit older data. This is from, I believe, 2010. And what this looks at, the blue boxes are men and the red boxes are women. And these are all for college graduates, right? So we're holding constant educational level. And what we see here is that even from day one on a job when they're 22 years old, right out of a college, having a college degree, that men start at a higher level. Now it's a pretty marginal level. At least it looks pretty close, even though percentage-wise it's significant. And we see that over the next 10 years, that gap grows bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, and we see in both groups there's a phenomenon whereby they hit a plateau, right? Both groups start going up and then both hit a plateau. That plateau happens around age 37 on average for women, and that plateau doesn't happen until around age 45 for men, right? So that is, a solid 8 more years of growth, exponential growth, relative to women that men experience before they hit that plateau, right? So yeah, the question that you'd want to naturally be asking is like, what happens here at age 37 for women, or what happens here at age 45 for men? Like, why do men continue to grow in terms of their average pay when women stop, relatively speaking, right? And to answer that question, we have to talk about motherhood, right? And this idea of the second shift that Arlie Hochschild gives us in that previous discussion thread. I want to throw you, before we jump into talking about feminism, to Emma Watson. This is a speech that she gave in front of the United Nations in 2014, where she talks about what is feminism and her identity as a feminist. So check out the video. I know this video is going long. Apologies for that. Check out the discussion thread, take a break, and then come on back. We're at about 33 minutes right now. So feminism. I think folks, depending on your age, your generation, how you came up, can have a very different relationship to this word, to this idea, to this concept. I think in general, it's growing as a term or an identity that people apply to themselves. I know as I was growing up in the 90s, in the early 2000s, feminism and being a feminist was kind of a charged term, right? It was a term that I think was misused and was used as a way to talk about like radical gender politics, to talk about people who maybe hate men, right? And here are some examples of prominent people, celebrities, and powerful individual folks disavowing or explaining why they don't identify as a feminist, right? Katy Perry saying, "I'm not a feminist, but I do believe in the power of women." Ironically, you have the CEO of Yahoo at the time, I don't believe she's still there anymore, saying, I don't think that I would consider myself a feminist, but I think, have sort of the militant drive and sort of the chip on the shoulder that sometimes comes with feminism. And I think it's too bad. But I do think feminism has become, in many ways, a more negative word, okay? So people are resistant to adopting this idea, right? And feminism, at its core, not even at its core, and in its entirety, is this idea that men and women should have equal rights. radical, right? What a crazy idea. How could anybody ever identify as a feminist? It's such a radical position that two groups of people should have equal rights, right? This does not mean that you have to hate men. It does not mean that we have to do away with any and all gender differences, that we should all dress the exact same, or we should all have our hair done the exact same. It doesn't deny that there are like certain like anatomical differences or physiological differences, right? It's not the argument that everything and always should be exactly the same, right? It's simply arguing that in terms of rights and access to resources and power and decision making, that men and women should be on an equal playing field. Okay. I have some more celebrity quotes on feminism, right? You can read that. I'm going quickly. The feminist movement. This could be an entire class by itself, and it actually is a class by itself. If you look at Sarah Smith teaches a history class at ARC on gender, sex, sexuality, feminism, all that stuff. Check it out. It's an awesome class. She's a great professor. We think about the feminist movement, right? Activist claims makers in three different waves, right? The first wave of feminists focused on the issue of getting access to the franchise, right? To the ability to vote and participate in democracy, okay? And this is, towards the end of the 19th century, right? After, the abolition of slavery and the end of the Civil War. Women then fought for the right to vote, right? They did not have the right to vote at the time, okay? Only men, only white men could vote. And they wanted the ability to own property as well, right? To have, political and economic wealth generating kind of rights, which they did not have. They won them, right? The second wave of feminism is the one that kind of comes into everyone's mind when they think about like the feminist movement, right? This is the women's lib movement, right? This is fighting for the ability to decide what happens to your body in terms of just giving you the ability to decide, how you want your body to participate in reproduction or not. The ability to get a job in any field you want, to be treated as a valuable member of a workplace, to be able to call out and have the legal system hold accountable men who sexually assault or sexually harass you, that's not okay, and that we need to design systems that better hold people accountable when they are violent, right? The third wave of feminism came 20, 30 years after the second wave, and it was a critique of that second wave. And it argued that a lot of that second wave was focused on the experience of white middle-class women, right? That, for example, arguing for the right to enter the workforce, for example, was not a situation that Black, Indigenous, Asian, or Latinx women needed to argue. They were already there. They've been there, right? They've been in the workforce. This idea of like the stay-at-home mother or like the homemaker kind of thing, that was not demographically speaking, was not a common experience among women of color, right? And the kinds of issues that the second wave feminists were pushing for did not take into consideration the experience of women of color. So this third wave of feminism was a push to broaden, right? Whose voice mattered in the movement, right? Whose issues came to be acted upon and seen as important, right? Right. This push towards intersectionality. Okay. How do people think about feminism, right? This is a poll that was done again around like 2014. I haven't been able to find an updated version of this, so if you can, let me know. I'll make the adjustment. But when people were just asked, do you identify as a feminist, right? We see that just over a third of women said yes, 2/3 said no, and only 18% of men said that yes, I identify as a feminist. After being told the definition of a feminist or feminism being someone who believes that men and women should have equal rights, should have equal opportunities, this jumps up to about 2/3 of women who identify as a feminist, and just shy of half of men. But it's important to note here, even after knowing the definition of feminism, this radical notion that men and women should have equal opportunity and access to resources and power and decision making, still a third of women and more than half of men do not identify as a feminist. Now the question becomes, is that because they don't identify as a feminist or because they disagree with the proposition that women should have equal rights? That is what we do not know. Okay? All we know is that they do not identify as a feminist. It has become increasingly popular for men to identify as a feminist, right? All these men wearing the Me Too pin at the Golden Globe Awards and on the red carpets, openly affiliating themselves with this, move to bolster women's rights, right? It has become a very popular thing to do, right? Not at all knocking the sincerity or the, how genuine these men are, these celebrity millionaires are in their support of gender justice and gender equity, but this is just something that wasn't always done, right? And it's a relatively speaking a modern thing, right? To adopt this moniker of a feminist. And as someone who does identify as a feminist, right, I have to also think critically about that and why didn't I always identify as a feminist, right? Is a conversation that I've had with with women in my life, with my wife and my mom and my sister. And also, what are the politics of me, waving the I'm a feminist flag, and receiving disproportionate, let's say, praise from some groups for identifying as feminist than I would if I were in a different kind of body, right? So, a former colleague of mine in grad school, he studied men's involvement in the gender justice movement, men's involvement in feminist organizations, and he argues for this concept that he calls the pedestal effect, whereby men who participate in feminist organizations tend to receive disproportionate praise and status and being seen as a great person for investing their time and energy in this kind of effort, whereby women who participate in these things are not given that kind of praise, aren't given that pat on the back, oh, it's so great for you, you're being involved in the feminist movement, good for you. I guess the assumption being that because they're primary kind of constituents, or they're primarily affected by this thing, they don't necessarily choose to be involved in this kind of work, whereas men who are involved don't have to. They're not expected to be involved in this kind of work, so they get praise. Disproportionate amounts of praise, right? So it's important that we balance the celebration of thank God more men are identifying as feminists with how easy is it to put on the pin and to put it on your Instagram and have everyone like it and say, oh my God, I'm definitely going to go see that James Franco movie or that, Benedict Cumberbatch movie because they're such great men. There's a certain amount of the need to walk the walk also, right? Not saying that these guys don't. Just observing that, historically speaking, men did not openly identify as feminists to the extent that they do now. We're going to skip through this. I just want to wrap up. It's way over the time. We'll end it here, and with the next slide, which is the final discussion thread for this module. Feminism and the feminist movement has not been without its backlash. Has not been met with universal progress and success. Okay, you would think that gender justice and that the ideology of feminism, that all people, regardless of your gender identity, should be treated equally, should have equal rights, political, economic, personal, right, physical safety and rights. That should be a valence issue, right? But it is not, right? In the last 20 years, there's been a rise of these groups that identify themselves as men's rights groups, right? The Proud Boys being among them. These are groups who argue that feminism has gone too far, that feminism has ruined our society, that it's a bad thing for our country, right? These are not it's not an accident that these are the same groups who are arguing that immigration is bad for our country, that having a black president was not good for our country, that all of these these signs that some people take as signs of progress, in other people's minds, in like hyper-conservative folks' minds, are signs of decline, right? Are threats to the way things should be. Of course, these are people who benefit from the way things should be, and folks who benefit from the way things have been, from the status quo, right? Of course, like I would, if I'm a ultra self-interested person, straight, white, able-bodied man in the United States, citizen man in the United States, yeah, of course I don't want any more competition for jobs or competition for, seats in a college classroom, or I want to be able to do whatever I want, right? And if the way that things have been historically means that like I don't have to do laundry or, emotionally care for my children, right? There's a lot of men who, would love to live that life, and who see the way that their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation lived as being preferable because they benefit from it. Another relatively speaking, recent incident was Gamergate. For anybody who doesn't know about Gamergate, you can look it up. But it was in the gamer community, the online gaming community, a small group of journalists started to become critical of women's representation in video games, right? Constantly being depicted as, objects for violence, and not being actually characters, but just being kind of like background victims. Oftentimes, victims that the player can brutalize, right? Thinking Grand Theft Auto here, right? Whereby you could, do all kinds of enact all kinds of violence on women, right? Both like sexual and physical violence to women's bodies. And these journalists who cover the gaming industry, who are gamers themselves, called attention to that and argued that, we needed to change the ways that women are depicted in video games. And there was a huge backlash from other gamers, mostly men, right? Male gamers, in the form of death threats, in the form of, just the most horrific kind of language and threats and violent sentiments that you can imagine were directed at these women who dared to criticize the status quo of the gaming world, right? So I'm gonna skip through the rest of this, just knowing that like people who argue that feminism has gone too far, that gender equity has already been achieved, why do we need to keep talking about it, are often people who benefit from gender inequity, right? President Trump, in the response to, I know I said I wouldn't talk about it, but in response to a swimmer at Stanford being caught sexually assaulting another student in an alley, and his name is Brock Turner, and being charged for that sexual assault with a very lenient sentence, by the way. Trump said to the media that it is a very scary time to be a young man in this country, insinuating that as someone who himself had been credibly accused multiple times of sexual assault and pedophilia, that suggesting that women can accuse anybody of sexual violence, and men are going to be assumed to be guilty of that, as though having the ability finally to be seen as credible and to have your accusation acted upon is a sign of change, of bad change, right? Of something that's scary or not desirable, right? Because men can be held accountable for being sexually violent, right? Okay, y'all. I want to finish up with this to zoom out just from gender and to consider this term of intersectionality. Okay, so Kimberly Crenshaw is a distinguished faculty member at the UCLA Law School, and she's kind of the foremost expert and the originator of this idea of intersectionality, right? And intersectional analysis. So I want you to check out this TED Talk she gave in 2016 and answer the questions, and then we're finally done. I apologize for how long this took, but hopefully you found it engaging, enlightening, and whatnot. So I'll see you in Module 14, because in the rest of this module will be guest guest talk from someone from the Gender Health Center in Sacramento. So